Okay, now it is my great pleasure to introduce Tim Wong. I first became acquainted with Tim's work with pipevine swallowtails. I was looking back in my emails actually in 2016. So it's been 10 years. Back in pre-Instagram for me, my Facebook era is when I first learned about Tim's work with pipevine swallowtails. And there was a coworker of mine at the time who was really excited about working with Tim on that project. It never came to fruition, but I've since followed his work and followed all the many things that Tim does in his very busy life, from this work with pollinators and pipevine swallowtails, his work as a scientist at the California Academy of Science, to his volunteering and managing of the Sisterhood Garden, a dahlia garden in South San Francisco, southern part of San Francisco. So it is my pleasure to introduce Tim Wong, who's going to tell us about all the many things that he does to keep himself busy and having fun.
Well, thank you, Jim, for having me come speak tonight. We do have a show and tell table here for later, so make sure to come check it out. We've got some live caterpillars. And I also want to especially thank Curtis from Soquel Nursery. They propagated a bunch of California pipevine for us to distribute tonight. So if you want to come buy one, they're $10 each. But yeah, it's a great price for California pipevine. But yeah, tonight I wanted to tell you a little bit more about our approach to pollinator gardening and dahlia hybridizing at a community garden called Sisterhood Gardens. So just a little bit about me. I've kind of come into horticulture through multiple avenues. Growing up in San Mateo County, I was interested in native butterflies growing on serpentine grassland. So I spent a lot of time raising butterflies. And that was actually my introduction to plants after realizing they had very specific host plant and nectar plant requirements. After that, I volunteered at the San Francisco Botanical Garden in their native plant collection. And I also got involved working as a horticulturist at the California Academy of Sciences, taking care of their tropical plant collection in their Osher rainforest, which also houses butterflies. In my neighborhood, I joined Sisterhood Gardens first as a volunteer and then joined their steering committee and have really kind of taken the lead on starting their dahlia garden and also their native plant collection. So here you can see I'm actually with a friend, Gina, in our dahlia garden at Sisterhood. And then these are pictures from our Osher rainforest. This is in San Mateo County, and that's actually underwater diving at the Cal Academy because we also garden underwater. There we go. Community gardens are often mixed-use gardens. They have a lot of different functions in a very small space, and Sisterhood is really no different. We're gardening for agriculture, for community. We have activities that are hosted there. Sometimes the public library will use our space. And that also means that we have to create distinct zones with often different growing goals in a very tight area. So we often include seating and other intentional spaces so that when people are using the garden at different times of the day, they can utilize it. A little bit more about Sisterhood Gardens. It was open to the public in 2016 after a lot of public interest from the neighborhood to open up a second community garden. There's one about 3 blocks away, and it had a waiting list of about 400 people to get into it. So in 2014, there is this empty lot in our neighborhood that the community voted to turn into a second green space, a community garden. It currently supports about 50 households directly. We are mostly a plot-based community garden with raised beds about 4 by 8 feet. So those are households in Ingleside. And we're governed by 10 steering committee members, approximately that kind of ebb and flow over the years. And here you can kind of see most of us hanging out in the dahlias and hanging out in front of our wood garden shed that many of the volunteers have helped build. You know, in our community garden, we have a lot of different growing goals, but some of the commonalities that we landed on with the steering committee and the garden members, many of them wanted food security, which are often accomplished through the types of produce and vegetables that are being grown in their raised beds and in their plots. We do have an orchard in one of our shared spaces as well. We also wanted to highlight accessibility and environmental justice. Our neighborhood is usually lower income, and there is a lack of access to functional green spaces. We also wanted to highlight beauty. We feel like there's always a lack of beauty in the world, and we wanted to bring beauty to our garden through flowers, cohesive plantings, native pollinators in general, and also native plants. So our growing climate is a bit different further north than here. In San Francisco, where we're growing, we're often in the fog. So you can see the fog belt coming in here pretty clearly across the Golden Gate Bridge. And this is Ocean Beach over here, which has all these sand dunes with a lot of coastal influence moving in. So you can see this aerial view here. Look how much the fog comes into the San Francisco Bay. And this is the microclimates in San Francisco are pretty neat. They can be full sun over here in the Mission and Soma. Ocean Beach can be totally inundated in the fog. And Sisterhood is right here. So we're pretty much in this fog belt and consistently about high 60s to low 70s most of the year. And we're zone 10, 10A or 10B. What this kind of means is we have a garden plan with really distinct zones with intentions of growing different plants. We're also working a little bit with the native landscape. We do have a couple coastal live oaks that were originally in this plot of land before the garden was built. You can see there's one street here called Arch Street, and Brotherhood Way is actually kind of a significant thoroughfare in the city. And we've chosen to incorporate beddings of native plants all along the perimeter wherever we can. We have a succulent garden on this side, which now has a mosaic staircase over here, an orchard with medicinal plants. And then another highlight for today will be our cut flower rows over here around the picnic tables, which are now mostly dahlias. And this interface here is particularly important for today because of the mixed use spaces in our garden and how these two different garden zones interact. So with the goal of incorporating native plants into our garden and incorporating them along our fence line, we essentially approach this as a native plant hedgerow. And to incorporate the native plants around Sisterhood, we really wanted to have those plants create a weed-resistant barrier. We have a lot of invasive plants around our neighborhood. The city comes and mows a lot of grasses, and there's a lot of wind-dispersed plants. So we figured kind of the front line of our garden was to beef up the perimeter. And we've been doing that with native plants. Then another benefit is we are able to attract other beneficial insects and animals that might help take care of garden pests. And the native plant perimeter also would reduce our water use. So our goal was to have a part of the garden where we wouldn't have to maintain it as much, irrigate it as much, and still support native wildlife. Specifically in our neighborhood, we really wanted to go a bit further and target a native butterfly. So we decided to incorporate California pipevine into our native plant plantings, essentially creating a bit of a pipevine oasis. And so in targeting that butterfly, we also incorporated other suitable nectar and resource plants. Oops, not too far. These are some examples of that hedgerow. Let's go a little further. I'm not sure why it's not going back. Oops, too far back. Okay, let's see. There's a lot of pictures in the slideshow, so it might be lagging a little bit. Well, I was going to mention that in this slide, you can see on Brotherhood Way, this is actually facing south. So this whole line of the garden gets a lot of sun. North side is on the top of the slide. Okay, so this is that same fence line that we were just looking at. This is Brotherhood Way. And you can see we have a variety of different California native plants in here. We've got a lot of white sage, which deals with the full sun quite well. We've got hummingbird sage. We've got coastal buckwheat, mimulus, monkey flower. And particularly of note, we have pipevine growing up our fence line. We have a number of plants here that were propagated from cuttings and from seed. So you can see we've kind of layered them in a bit from all the way from the concrete sidewalk, which gets the brunt of public use, wind, weed whacking from the city, and that kind of is layered into slightly taller shrubs that dominate the space and keep weeds from encroaching in, and kind of finishing with pipevine on the fence line. Here's another view of our fence line along Arch Street. This one gets more afternoon sun, so it gets a little more shade earlier in the day. You can see we have a lot of hummingbird sage. This is actually the Las Politas form. And we've incorporated actually more ribes in this part of the garden, or flowering currant. Although we do like to grow the pipevine on the fence line, we often find that planting it with companion plants or shrubs can give it some structure, allowing it to grow up in a couple different directions. And here you can see, even on the fence line, we're getting a little bit of fruit development. And if you look really closely, there's a couple caterpillars right here. Depending on the garden conditions, it can be pretty successful. So, some people have vines that are 50 years old or more, and so they can get, 30, 40 feet wide. In a typical garden setting, they can be pretty slow growing. So if you prune it, you can really manage its size pretty easily. I've seen people keep vines, under 10 feet wide and 10 feet tall. But if allowed to grow, they're opportunistic. And a lot of it's also based on water. Here again, I'm kind of showing and highlighting my favorite companion planting for pipevine, which is with flowering currant. It's a kind of a loose shrub, and so they don't seem to compete too much with each other. It's actually a great highlight for both the flowers of the California pipevine, which are these smoking pipe-shaped blooms, and then the pendant pink blooms of the flowering currant. And kind of coincidentally, they both tend to bloom in the wintertime to late winter. And these blooms, when they open up, end up becoming a great resource for nectar for California pipevine swallowtails. They do like it. And this photo was taken in the San Francisco Botanical Garden. So some other nectar plants that we've considered adding to our native plant hedgerow. Naturally, for butterflies, they really require two types of resource plants. Host plants are what we might call their larval lifeline, the plants that they reproduce on that feeds their caterpillar stage. But that might actually be pretty different from what the adult butterflies might need day to day. So you can think of, I've heard it described, nectar plants are like the gas station. The butterflies need to fuel up before they head on to another host plant or another garden. And by incorporating these around your pipevine or in your garden, you can really create those opportunities where they can find nectar resources. So here we have San Francisco wallflower, California aster, and this is blue dix, which is actually a native geophyte or a native bulb. And if you go on a lot of hikes around here this time of the year, this is actually a very significant nectar plant for early spring butterflies. Yeah. Sure thing. Yeah. Oh yeah, you can hear, I can hear myself a lot better. Okay, so let's see if this video will play. Jane, if you wouldn't mind hitting that play button. This is a short clip of pipevine swallowtails in our garden. They're nectaring on some verbena, Lilacina de la Mina. It's a quite short video. But you can see there's a male and two females on here. So just if you're trying to garden for butterflies, particularly pipevine swallowtails, make sure not only to plant the pipevine plant, but some good flowering plants to keep them fueled up. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind advancing manually. Okay, so we showed you a couple plants on our fence line, and they were quite beautiful. They had a lot of other native plants and nectar plants around them. This I like to show because this is a pretty unsightly part of our garden. It's right at this corner. There's a gate right here. There's a lot of foot traffic. We always get trash dropped here from the neighborhood. There's nasturtium here. But check this out. So there's pipevine growing right on the ground here, and you can see new growth popping up. If we zoom in closer, look what we got here. So one thing that we've noticed, we're growing in a pretty cool climate zone in San Francisco, which might be very different from your zone down here. But what we tend to notice is the butterflies love to egg lay near the ground, which is something a lot of people don't think about, seeing that the vine naturally wants to climb up, or in certain conditions, people are recommended to plant the vine in more shade. But what we notice is that this part of the garden is often getting the first sun of the day. It gets pretty hot. It's right near the concrete over here. And then the new growth that these butterflies really favor is really juicy and delicious. And there must be something about either the microclimate down here, possibly the temperature, or the quality of the plant material that it's producing down there that is virtually irresistible. And so I always like to remind people that even in some corners of your garden that might not be the most, pretty, or maybe not functional for other things, might still be usable butterfly habitat and may even be more favored. And this vine is actually one right here. There's a garden hose that's often leaking that tends to water this section, so it does really well. But there are about 30 vines on this fence line, and this vine gets the most action out of all of them. So just a little bit more about our friend, the California pipevine swallowtail. They are native to Northern California, and the scientific name is Batis phyllinor hirsuta, which tends to refer to this extra fuzz that they have. This nice side profile shows the fuzz on their thorax and their abdomen. And then their caterpillars are these bright orange and black larvae, which we have many of today that you can come check them out. They're definitely Giants fans. And then over here, you can see the ventral, the underside coloration of the butterfly, which is characterized by these large orange spots with blue and white highlights. This is a common coloration for both the male and female on the underside, and something we call aposematic coloration, or in other words, a warning coloration that this butterfly is poisonous and bad to eat if you're a bird or a lizard. And then over here on this side, you can see there actually is quite a bit of a difference between male and female adult butterflies. The males are going to have a more iridescent blue on their dorsal side, and the females a little bit more kind of demure, dark gray and purple. And this is a type of sexual selection that you're seeing. The female butterflies are selecting and mating with males with more blue. So if you're gardening for butterflies, it's really helpful to know where they are in relationship to your garden and where they're naturally found. Because California pipevine swallowtail butterflies only utilize California pipevine as a host plant, they're not really going to be found very far away from it. And so if you look at this map, I always recommend for people to check something like iNaturalist. Where are people making observations and seeing the butterfly? And these are just citizens that are saying, hey, I saw one here or here or here. And you can really kind of notice there are concentrations of where people are making active observations. You could also go into the search, and instead of searching for the butterfly, you can put in the plant. And that might also indicate like where you're kind of near established colonies or populations of the butterfly. All this to say they are really established in Northern California, in the Marin Headlands, Angel Island, a few parts of San Francisco, Oakland, and then all the way up into the American River in Sacramento, up to Table Mountain, all the way up to Redding, actually. But in the other direction, further south, even south here in the peninsula, they become far less common. So it's actually much harder to attract them down here unless multiple gardens or neighborhoods are working together to plant a network of plants. So, but just by show of hands, how many people down here are growing California pipevine? Okay, quite a few. Okay. Hopefully you guys live pretty close to each other. There might be some. You might get lucky, and the more people that plant, the better odds everyone has. So I recommend if you're going to plant a plant in your yard, maybe convince a few neighbors to plant a few too. I would actually recommend planting a couple if you can. As you saw from Sisterhood, we had about 30 vines on our fence line, and just a few of them were really attractive, but in different gardens, the conditions could be really variable, and someone might have a really favorable spot. And the more people that plant, the more they can kind of use one garden as a stepping stone to another. So really consider working together on that. So if you are really lucky, you might get some of this in your garden. This is what it looks like when butterflies are mating. They copulate abdomen to abdomen. And after the female has mated in particular, her main focus is on egg laying. The eggs are bright red and laid in clusters, anywhere from 3 to 30 on average. And they are poisonous. They take on the ristoloic acids from the plant they feed on as a caterpillar. So that is why they're bright red. This should be a video if we can hit that again. This shows actually a butterfly ovipositing in the San Francisco Botanical Garden. And we kind of notice the same thing here. Despite the vine growing up trees, fence lines all over the garden, we almost always see the butterflies in our cooler climate ovipositing near the ground. Further inland, where it's much warmer, we have gotten more reports of people seeing the butterfly egg laying higher up on the plant. But we really tend to notice that the quality of the growth and perhaps the temperature might be two factors that really are enticing for female butterflies to egg lay near the ground. So if you are growing pipevine and not seeing a lot of action, consider letting the vine put out more runner vines on the ground and more shoots. If you add mulch to the bottom of the plant in the wintertime, you can get a lot of new growth out of the ground like this. So these are all different female butterflies, all egg laying just a few inches within the ground. So once those eggs hatch, there's a lot that goes on after that. You can come up to the table later and see a little bit of what's happening today, but you can see most of the stages of complete metamorphosis here. There's actually one larval stage missing here, but there are 5 larval stages called instars, which then develop into a chrysalis or a pupa. So you can see it here. It's got a nice silk girdle that secures a pupa to whatever substrate they're on. They actually can spend most of their time in this stage, almost up to a year. So after they develop into a chrysalis, you might want to be careful about cleaning up your garden, checking for these, because if you're doing some winter cleanup, you might be taking butterflies out of your garden. But then these will emerge as adult butterflies the following year, oftentimes between February and May, with a peak usually in about April. I think we skipped one slide. Yeah, here we go. So, one thing I always like to reflect on is that when you're planting native plant gardens, you're often connecting people with plants. And this is one of the ways that we're able to do it at Sisterhood. So you can see we have, caterpillars are really popular with kids. And you can see one of our garden members, Mayumi, over here, releasing a newly hatched butterfly that we had kept in our greenhouse at the garden as a chrysalis. So these are all moments and opportunities that we didn't have before in our garden before incorporating our native plant hedgerow with California pipevine. So shifting gears a little bit, and you might be wondering, how does a dahlia garden have to do with anything else that we just talked about? But as a mixed-use space, we have a lot of those different goals in our garden, and one of them was to bring in some beauty. The dahlias are the official flower of San Francisco. They were declared that in 1926, so this is actually our centennial in San Francisco for the dahlia. And we selected this flower because it was easy to grow in our climate, relatively, thriving without a lot of extra resources, very productive with blooms, and incredibly variable with form that we wanted to make more accessible to people in our community. So just showing you where we started when we planted this garden. We decided to begin a dahlia or cut flower garden in 2020. So right in the pandemic, we really didn't have a lot to do, and we had a lot of weeds and not a lot of great plants. So you can see here we've got picnic tables. We have this big open space, this corner of the garden. Those are the oak trees that I referred to earlier. And that's actually our fence line, which just has very small pipevine plants and other baby native plants right now. So both gardens actually kind of started about the same time. We prepared the area, hand weeding and actually layering with cardboard and sheet mulch. And then to protect our flowers, we have a lot of gophers in San Francisco. So we created long gopher baskets out of hardware cloth. Yeah, this was a great way to protect our plants without individually caging each individual dahlia plant. So we could do long rows. We just basically rolled out the silver carpet, folded it in half a tube, and then mended the ends, and that was our long gopher basket. Oh, I should also mention, these picnic tables before people couldn't even see. The weeds were, up to your waist. So we weed whacked this all down, and then we realized we had picnic tables there. So we love growing dahlias from seed. We kind of discovered that they were pretty accessible to grow, but when you grow them from seed, you have a high likelihood of discovering something new. They have really broad genetics. They are polyploid. They have multiple sets of genes. And so they are capable of expressing many different phenotypes for everything from the flower form, the shape of the flower or flower color, petal shape, stem color, leaf shape, tuber size, you name it, they are variable in those traits. So we decided to grow them from seed for fun. So we collected some seeds off of dahlias that we had grown in previous years, and we started them off in our greenhouse, growing them in 3 or 4 inch pots. And then we plant them in one long gopher basket along our native plant fence line. And here you can see they're only just a few inches apart, maybe like 1 or 2 inches apart, really. We really cram them in there because our goal is to just discover a new bloom. They don't have to become big plants because we'll do more with them later. So this is about, let's say, late June in our garden. So now what you're seeing here is the dahlias are about 3 feet tall. These are all first year seedlings, so from the previous slide. None of them have ever grown on the planet ever before. These short rows next to the picnic tables are what we would call second year seedlings, selections from this long row that we decided had good traits, color, shape, or form that we thought could make a good flower. And then farther back behind the picnic table are our named varieties. Varieties that were previously grown by someone else in someone else's garden and named. They could be in the American Dahlia Society catalog. Those are usually varieties we purchased online. And we usually will save seeds off of these named varieties, ones with good form or ones that we really like to get traits off of, to produce our first year or second year seedlings. And I really want to note again just how close the Dahlia garden is to our native pollinator garden, which actually has a lot of implications of how we care for the dahlias. So we don't use any insecticides or BT, which could have an impact on the Lepidoptera larva, which could be growing on the fence line right next to our dahlias. So we really want to make sure whatever practices we're implementing in one part of the garden isn't negatively impacting another goal that we have. And that's really one of the main ties between these two. So how do we use our Dahlia garden? We host a lot of events. This is actually a day that the Dahlia Society came by and we're doing a U-pick. We're cutting a lot of the blooms to give away. Again, our goal was to share beauty and abundance. So this is our garden in probably early to mid-July. And you can see a lot of the rows are planted by color. So it makes it a little easier for people to shop for some of their blooms. And then this is peak season. This is usually late July to early August. Again, what you're actually looking at here are named varieties. So the seedlings are way back here along the fence line. But you can tell again that we're kind of organizing by color. But dahlias come in what are recognized to be a little bit more than 20 different forms or shapes. And people discover new ones all the time when they grow them from seed. And eventually there's a category for all the misfits called novelty form. All the ones that don't fit in, and when they get enough novelties, that becomes a new form or a new class. So we've really focused on hybridizing for dahlias that have new forms, using plants like this one here called valley porcupine, which has a really spiky shape, or actually this one here called Carolina Wegmans. That's a water lily form. Those are 2 forms that can be difficult to achieve. So generally we'll grow water lilies in a separate part of the garden to reduce the amount of pollen that we're getting in from other forms that might contaminate the genetics. So another way that we use our dahlias, we do a fundraiser every year where we accept donations in turn for bouquets. So you can see this is Jamie Chan here. She's actually one of our steering committee members at Sisterhood and one of the founding members. She's in our neighborhood. She's helping to organize kind of the U-pick free-for-all that's going on. We've got all these buckets of different blooms here, filler flowers as well, but people usually are able to accommodate and get a few stems per bouquet. So this is just one of the ways that we're able to use the dahlias to meet our goals. And a fun one here, this dahlia right here is called For Robin. That's named after Robin Williams and was discovered at the Dahlia Dell in Golden Gate Park. So if you're ever at the Dahlia Dell, actually about a third of the varieties there are still new ones that haven't been named yet. So how do we collect and save our seeds? So there are actually really two methods of pollinating dahlias and saving the seeds. One is called open pollination. So we're really letting things like butterflies and bees do the work. And dahlias are predominantly bee pollinated because the wild form of dahlias looked a bit like a daisy. They're very attractive to bees and have a lot of pollen for protein. But both bees and butterflies will go to them for nectar. And so if we're allowing bees and butterflies to go to these, we can simply collect the seed pods later on when they're drying out. They take about 6 weeks to mature, and we can tag with flagging tape the name varieties that we're collecting so we know at least who the seed parent is, even if we don't know who the pollen parent is. So we know about like half of the contributed genetics for that trait. But if you want to go a bit further, you can do what's called a hand pollination. So when you do a hand pollination, you can take a Q-tip or a paintbrush and transfer pollen from one desired bloom to another. That way you know both parents in the cross. But then you want to make sure that bees and butterflies don't get to the bloom after that, because they could be bringing in pollen from anywhere. So you can use an organza bag to cover your bloom to limit the access so you're not getting pollen that might be contaminating your intentional cross. So then it's pretty much the same process after that. Once this seed head matures, you can tag it again with flagging tape and let it dry out. And then we collect and sow the seeds in the following February. Yeah, some of these actually we collected a little bit early. So the developing seed heads themselves, if they get fog, moisture, or rain, so these were probably collected in about October. I think we had an incoming rainstorm coming in. So I wanted to make sure that the drying seed heads didn't get wet up here, because if they do, it can rot all the seeds. So oftentimes if you're collecting seeds in the fall, you might have to keep them dry or protect them. You can use corn husk bags or pull them in like this and let them kind of mature with a little bit of water. But you want to make sure not to cut them too early, otherwise the seeds may not have fully matured. Oh, fun fact, that's a stingray radiograph up there. That's in my living room. So once we've sown those seeds, this is an example of our seedling row 1 year. And one thing you'll notice, Jackie's holding a bunch of great blooms here. She's in our community garden. You'll get all kinds of shapes and sizes, so all of these seeds could have been collected from one flower form, for example, which is kind of part of the fun. You never know what you're going to get. And you can see we've gotten some big blooms here. This is about 8 inches across. A tiny one here that's about 3 inches across in yellow. And then if you look here in the middle, you'll see a lot of what we called open-centered dahlias. So with dahlias with lower petal count kind of revert back to that daisy format that they had, a single row of petals. So that's actually a dominant trait, but Dahlia hybridizes over the years have selected for blooms with more rows of petals called fully doubled flowers. So this one here would be a fully doubled flower, but this one here might be an open-centered. And depending on what garden you're in and what your hybridizing goals are, you could cull whichever ones you didn't want. So these are just some of the open-centered ones we got. If I showed this at the Dahlia Society meeting, they'd be like, these are hideous. But we tend to keep them because in our community garden, people see beauty in a lot of different things. So we'll keep them for most of the season. And then if we are limited on space, we'll actually share these out with anyone else who might want to try them in their community garden or their backyard if they want to just see what it's like to grow a dahlia. Fun fact, dahlias are also edible. So you can eat their tubers, you can eat their flowers. That's actually the original reason why they were cultivated, was originally for food in Mexico before they were domesticated and hybridized for their blooms. But these are some of the ones that we did keep. These are now our 3rd year seedlings. So typically dahlias have pretty unstable genetics. So from year to year, they can actually change quite a bit. So these are some examples of our favorites. This is a nice big purple one. This one's very coppery in color. And this one was collected from an apricot water lily, but it came out this really lovely white. So we'll be growing these again to see if their traits are consistent, but this is kind of our end goal with the dahlias, is to create something new that we might want to share and have people grow in their own gardens and eventually name. This is an example I'd like to show because, like I mentioned, dahlias can be somewhat unstable and can change form or color year to year and can actually look very different from one growing condition to another, or even in one garden to another. So here you can see the first year it really was kind of a lighter color, had a little bit more yellow in it. And as soon as we moved it to another part of our garden and even our second growing site at the Dahlia Dell in Golden Gate Park, it became much pinker. Still a beautiful flower, but you can see quite a bit different in how it looks. So sometimes blooms will even degrade to the point that they now have a yellow center, which are the disc florets. I should also mention that dahlias are composite flowers. So each of these petals is actually a petaloid or a petal array floret. And then the disc florets are the small yellow flowers in the center of the plant. So sometimes seedlings will degrade and they'll start to have fewer petals over time. These are just a couple other seedlings that we decided to keep. They're a little bit smaller, but we really like that they kind of emulate some of the forms we were going for. I mentioned earlier, we were really interested in getting seedlings off a plant called valley porcupine, which is a novelty. And that's actually a seedling off of it, which is really nice. It's almost like a pink version of the parent plant. And then this one here was collected off of a water lily. So when it's smaller, it kind of has that format, but as it gets bigger, it kind of starts to look more like a cactus. And when you're growing seedlings, you'll get a lot of these intermediate forms as well. But that's just part of the fun of growing all of the different kinds. So what happens if you find a first year seedling that you really like and it's the first time it's been around? You do want to tag it. So sometimes you might only get one bloom off of a seedling during the growing season because of how crowded we plant them. So as soon as we like something, we take a picture of it and we'll tag it. If we're just observing it, we might put a clothespin on it. And if we really like it, we might put a second clothespin or a third. But at the end of the season, what we really need is we'll put a tree tag and we'll go to the very bottom of the plant at the ground level and make sure we put it around the base. So that way, if we dig up the tubers of this plant, we know exactly which bloom it was. And when growing seedlings, we always find it's good to have outside input and help. So in this case, we invited a bunch of dahlia judges to our garden to judge our garden. And so we have Christine Albrecht from Santa Cruz, Iris Wallace from Santa Cruz, Lou Paradise, and Deborah and Pat are all from the Dahlia Society of California in San Francisco. And they came over and gave us a really nice evaluation of our garden, gave us tips on which blooms were good to save. They've also seen a lot of flowers, so they were able to tell us if it was something kind of more novel or if it looked like something already out in the market or if it had better traits. So if you're going to dive into growing from seed, it's always helpful to have an extra eye. And it definitely seems like everyone loves dahlias. Again, we got into them because our community garden members absolutely loved them. When we incorporated them into a cut flower program, we had sunflowers, we had bachelor's button, cosmos, other filler flowers, and we let them cut their own. And the dahlia rows, they used to be this tall, and then by the end of the first season, they had cut them to the ground because they loved them so much. So we went from having about 5 rows of dahlias to about 20. And I think a nice tie-in is that not only do the people love dahlias, but also our pollinators. So growing so close to our fence line, we get lots of pipevine swallowtails visiting our blooms, but also because they're bee pollinated, a lot of action from native bees. So often we find when we're growing for one thing in the garden, you end up growing for something else as well. And these are some helpful references if you want to take a look. There's some references for butterfly and pollinator resources in the city. There's a great video from KQED on the whole life cycle of a pipevine swallowtail that is very charismatically narrated, so I'd recommend that. Resources on how to propagate California pipevine from cuttings, and also from the Dahlia Society. Since it is our centennial, my plug is you should come to our show in August. And that's about it. So thank you all for having me, and hopefully you will try growing some pipevine and some dahlias.